University Archivist at Caltech, but in the spirit of rewinding, I'm going to be telling you about work that I did before I had that job. Specifically, most of my talk today is going to come from dissertation research that I did in history of science, which is going to look more like history of technology and media studies, but my PhD is in history of science, so officially this is a history of science project. Hopefully there will be some interesting dimensions that will tie together with some of the other conversations that we've been having today. In the late 1960s, video recorders became portable. They left the television studio for the artist studio, the psychiatric hospital, and the streets. And the research that I'm going to be presenting to you today is a sort of network history of the conversations that happened around this phenomenon. So the people who obtained these new portable video recorders talked to each other. They often talked to each other across disciplines, including the disciplines that you see represented here on the screen. And they talked to each other about the significance of this new technology for their minds, for their social relations, for politics, for the future of media and society. And this project is also about the resources that videographers drew on in the late 60s and early 70s. And those resources, of course, included video recorders themselves, but they also included less tangible resources, practices like watching oneself on tape, ideas like the idea of collective consciousness, which I'll get into a little bit, and ideas of ethereality and of the relationship between the tangible, the tape itself, and the intangible, the images on it or the ideas discussed around it. And a lot of these resources have remained stable in the decades since, even as the technologies through which we do work like this have become digital. One critical product of these discourses, which I've come back to throughout the project, is Donna Haraway's 1985 Manifesto for Cyborgs, which has a whole passage about videotape that it is not the part of the essay that I see discussed the most, and so I want to draw attention to it. About camcorders, Haraway writes, "Our best machines are made of sunshine. They are all light and clean because they are nothing but signals, electromagnetic waves, a section of spectrum." And she writes that the consequence of interpreting machines as nothing but signals, which she's not really endorsing, but is saying we do sort of whether we want to or not, is that they are as hard to see politically as they are materially. They are about consciousness. So this is the kind of technology that I want to talk about today, is these machines that are hard to see politically, that can be tangible. You can see them on the screen right here, but that we think of as creating something that we can easily translate, or maybe with some difficulty, as we know as archivists, translate between substrates, but that persists nonetheless. And the other thing that Haraway calls attention to in this passage in writing about these miniature technologies is how closely linked they are to violence and to military industrial origins. So that's where I'm going to start, with the development of high fidelity magnetic audio recording technology during World War II in Nazi Germany as a fascist technology, as a technology for standardizing propaganda broadcasts, as a technology for war reporting, as a technology for wiretapping. And this is a technology that through American occupations was seized from Germany and made available over a couple generations of the technology to Japanese manufacturers who transistorized and miniaturized it. So this sort of post-World War II American hegemony is critical to magnetic recording moving both from Europe to North America and then moving from North America to Asia, because the US has this, this military power globally at this moment. At the same time, during and just after World War II, American engineers at RCA were developing compact television cameras for guided bombs, which were deployed so that a pilot could pilot the bomb or even pilot an airplane without actually being on it and fly the bomb or airplane into a target through remote control. And so a lot of the miniaturization of television cameras that's necessary to create portable technologies in the 60s comes about right at the end of World War II and in the years after as part of these efforts. In the 1950s, engineers at Ampex in Northern California developed techniques for recording video on tape and start to bring these technological trajectories together. There's a whole story to tell here about compression, which is exciting, but not what I'm focusing on today. But this creates the possibility of applying this technology to the television industry as well as to radio, standardizing broadcasts. And then pretty immediately applying the same sort of compression of data that's used for video recording to data recording for airplane and military testing. So that by the early 1960s, Ampex was serving the TV industry. They were selling these big quadruplex recorders for hundreds of thousands of dollars, but half their business was to the Air Force and other defense clients who were buying similar equipment for recording data and experimenting with their new aviation technologies. And over the 1960s, this technology, again, was miniaturized primarily by Japanese companies. So by 1962, Sony has equipment that 2 strong people can carry around. By 1965, maybe 1 strong person can carry it around. And by 1967, most people can carry it around. So this is the sort of trajectory of miniaturization that occurs quite rapidly with video over the course of the 60s. Now, in addition to rewinding for you today, I'm doing a little bit of splicing because I wanted to drop in here a separate talk that I just really wanted to share with this audience, and so I hope it will fit well enough. And we'll just call it spaghetti. Oeg invented the wheel and Sony invented the portable video recorder, begins the 1973 Spaghetti City video manual. And something happened in between those 2 inventions to the way people exchange information that makes this manual necessary. Oeg had to maintain his wheel in order to use it. And if Sony technicians were the only people using video, nothing would be different. But what about the rest of us? Oeg taught himself how to fix the wheel and passed that information on to other wheel users. Unfortunately, video people can't depend on Sony and other VTR manufacturers to do the same. So this introduction, again from 1973, juxtaposes a history of innovation from wheel to videotape with a history of maintenance from Oeg to professional Sony technicians, and a third history of the communication and distribution of maintenance expertise. Oeg, living in a state of primitive socialism, freely shared his knowledge with others. Sony, a product of capitalism, regarded their expertise as exclusive intellectual property. What changed between them were the media of maintenance. The 1970s were a time of interpretive flexibility for video recorders, and what this mini talk that I've dropped into the talk is about is the way that manuals were among one of the venues in which people interpreted what video recorders were. To explain how to use and maintain a tool is to imagine who its users and maintainers are, who you're explaining to. And this is indeed one of the ways that technologies come to have social significance. Sony did in fact publish service manuals, but as the Spaghetti City video manual itself noted, they were expensive and they assumed a lot of prior knowledge of electronics. Service manuals portrayed video recorders as requiring expert maintenance performed by licensed professionals. Other guides to video technology mostly focused on production values, explaining how to set up lighting and microphones in order to produce a professional aesthetic. But they also assumed that users would turn to technicians for maintenance. The Spaghetti City video manual, in contrast, suggested that maintenance could be conceived of as just another aspect of using video equipment, which was for many of the readers more about understanding and experiencing new media than about producing professional quality footage. In effect, the manual proposed maintenance, like making your own video, as a context for a kind of participatory technology. And as you can see on the cover here, the manual attributed its authorship to the Video Freaks, which was a collective of artists and educators. But more specifically, 3 members of that group contributed to the book's production. One was Perry Teasdale, who later wrote that when he got into video, he had been, quote, bored with psychedelics, disconnected by temperament from the militant core of the anti-war movement, adrift and apprehensive. Once he started experimenting with this equipment, a CBS executive named Don West soon hired him and other members of what became the Video Freaks to shoot an experimental television pilot about the counterculture. And this story, I think, has best been told in the documentary, Here Come the Video Freaks, which I recommend if you're curious. It's a recent documentary on this. So Teasdale, in this new context, found himself working alongside Chuck Kennedy, an electronics technician who had previously served in the Army and maintained surveillance equipment. When CBS fired Don West and everyone working for him, they decided that they didn't really want a magazine series about the counterculture. Teasdale and Kennedy were among several refugees who formed the Video Freaks, moving into a large house in the small town of Lanesville, New York. Once they were there, they built an unlicensed television station and traveled across the state providing video workshops funded by the New York State Council on the Arts. Teasdale's technical education, which he channeled into the Spaghetti City video manual, was informal. "I'd hung over Chuck's shoulder for so long," he wrote, "I'd absorbed the rudiments of video maintenance." Although painter Ann Woodward was the member of the Video Freaks least engaged in video production, her illustrations were critical to the manual, and indeed probably did more than Teasdale's writing to distinguish it from other guides to the technology of video. They too conveyed technical knowledge. They were also key to correlating the text in the guide to objects in the world, serving the same function as the images in a nature guide. The book's title referred to the spaghetti of cables that accompanied videography, which the guide would help users understand. "If you've just gotten access to some video equipment," suggested the text, "look at the pictures in the manual and see if you can relate them to the equipment around you." The Video Freaks' rural and nomadic lives shaped their philosophy of maintenance as well. By teaching the users to maintain their equipment, explained its back cover, the Spaghetti City video manual was meant to reshape both the economy and the geography of maintenance, providing an alternative to a repair industry that is expensive, overburdened, and virtually non-existent outside major metropolitan areas. If you were in New York City, you might go to Chi Tuen Lui, who still has a shop in the city and who catered to artists and other experimental videographers. But in other places, maintenance was a persistent challenge. When Black Panther Eldridge Cleaver was in Algeria using video recorders, for example, he would often call American videographers and ask for help fixing his equipment when it wouldn't work. So video recorders were objects that facilitated collaborations between people who were not otherwise engaged in a common project. Even when these collaborations transgressed social boundaries, so the artists in New York who Cleaver was calling were white artists who otherwise were perhaps less committed to the revolution than he was, but they were interested in helping him with his video equipment. Even when they transgressed these boundaries, they were deeply structured by them. Within the Video Freaks, women, particularly Nancy Kane and Carol Vontobel, learned the same technical skills that Teasdale did. "Chuck taught us a lot," recalled Vontobel. "Even I soldered batteries. Even I could take the case off a pack or make it work sometimes." But others outside the group didn't expect technical ability of women the way they did of Perry Teasdale, who wrote that people trusted him to repair their equipment before he actually knew how to do so, because he was a member of the Video Freaks, and I'll add parenthetically, at least male Video Freaks, were techies, right? This was the reputation. So Teasdale benefited, and Vontobel and Kane did not, from an association between masculinity and technical expertise. The manual also facilitated the movement of expertise up a class hierarchy, from working class technicians like Chuck Kennedy to artists and intellectuals often drawn from college-educated middle and upper classes. In an industry in which professionals were working class, deprofessionalizing skills didn't necessarily mean distributing them from elites to the masses. Although it has long been out of print, used copies of the Spaghetti City Video Manual remain critical reference books for video archivists, and I imagine some of you in this room are familiar with the book, and circulate more now among university credentialed people than they do among people who are trying to repair their own video equipment. That said, the Spaghetti City Video Manual is more of an introduction to the technical principles of video recording than a guide to repair techniques. It begins with an overview of the physics and engineering involved in video recording, and explains how some specific components function. And the concrete maintenance techniques from cleaning lenses to replacing a Vidicon tube consume only 30 pages out of 116. Two sections at the end suggest why. The book's last major section, entitled Some Less Basic Maintenance, is a guide to using service manuals to learn more. So it takes the reader back to the Sony-produced manuals that the book mostly moves away from. It explains how to read block diagrams, schematics, and other symbolic representations of machines that make up such books. It is thus to Sony, not Og, that the freaks suggest users turn if they want to develop their maintenance skills beyond the horizons of their book. What the manual provides readers then is a technical understanding of video, not exhaustive expertise, but enough for familiarity. This understanding also had a political valence. In the same year in which the Gay Video Workshop was promoted with a poster stating that we must direct our technology or it will be used to destroy us. This is probably my favorite thing I found in an archive in doing this research. This is in the New York State Council on the Arts papers in the New York State Archives from one of the many grants that they made in the 70s. In this same year, 1973, the Video Freaks concluded their book with its most explicitly political passage. This is the same wonderful technology that brought you bombs guided by video cameras, wiretaps, and other forms of covert surveillance, wrote Teasdale. This technology has provided us with tools that are at the same time exciting and frightening. If we are to use these tools, it is essential that we understand their very nature. It was by learning at least the basics of maintaining video equipment that users could adopt this participatory stance, developing the expertise necessary to critique authoritarian uses of media and reshape video into a more democratic technology. So, okay, so this is the splice right here, going away from the talk within a talk back to where I was. So part of this project is about the materiality of video and the ways in which this equipment circulated and the ways in which it came to be. Part of it, as I mentioned, is also about the ideas that often moved with it, and particularly the ideas about the human mind that often moved with it. So I'm going to jump a little bit, actually not very far in time or space, but jump in title here, to the TV as a creative medium exhibit, which appeared at the Howard Wise Gallery in New York in 1969, which in the history of video art is often looked at as a sort of turning point. And I'm going to talk briefly about a few of the works of art that appeared in this exhibit. One of them is Every Man's Mobius Strip by Paul Ryan, which consisted of a monitor, a camera, a deck, an audio tape player, all enclosed in a curtained booth. If you stepped into this space, you would have actually just seen a blank monitor at first. This was a situation which expected your participation. You would have also seen a camera, and then you would have heard an audio recording, at least if the operator pressed play, you would have heard. React to the following people: Nixon, your mother, Eldridge Cleaver, Teddy Kennedy, you. For the next 10 seconds, do what you want. Now, let your face grow sad. Turn away from the camera. Now turn back. Press the stop button. Thank you. The operator would then rewind and replay the videotape, and you would be alone in this curtained booth watching yourself. And each recording would tape over the previous one, providing you with a unique private experience that you knew no one else would have, right? So it's not surveillance for someone else to watch you, it's self-observation. This was a translation into installation form of the psychological video experiments of its artist, Paul Ryan, a 26-year-old former Catholic monk who was working as a research assistant to Marshall McLuhan. And this was also a translation into installation form of experiments which other people were doing around Ryan, and particularly which psychotherapists were doing with showing video to their patients. So there was a whole practice going back to the early 60s and in film form and audio tape form going back to the 50s of recording patients and having them watch themselves, either to see how disordered they appear and therefore be motivated to change, or to be able to re-experience the conversation between therapist and patient, be able to pause at different moments and take the conversation in different directions. And I'm going to move pretty quickly through this piece, but one of Ryan's collaborators in sort of discovering the therapeutic world of video at this moment was his fellow video artist, Frank Gillette, who sort of ran into on the street one of the therapists who was involved in this world, and they started talking because they both had video recorders, and it was 1968 and not many people had video recorders, right? And so this sort of produced these encounters that led to the kind of experiments that we just saw in Every Man's Mobius strip. So this is sort of a little glimpse of the psychiatric world that preceded that. A particular enthusiasm about this Robert Burns poem with the line, "Oh, what some power the gifty gie us to see ourselves as others see us." And this idea that video is this technology that lets you see yourself through someone else's eyes. And this is a sort of a revolutionary change in psychiatric practice. And indeed, they have claims about the efficacy of this treatment that show, according to these fairly small experiments, that it was working. So, like I said, I'm going through this part very quickly, in part because I've talked about it at UCLA before. And I'm happy to talk about it more with anyone who's interested. But the idea of watching oneself on tape becomes crucial to the art theory discourse about video as well in the 1970s. So perhaps the most widely read sort of art theoretic work on video is Rosalind Krauss's The Aesthetics of Narcissism, which is a sort of critique of video artists who engage in this kind of practice. Paul Ryan himself used these experiments not just to think about the self and the mind, but also to think about the nature of videotape as a medium. And he came back over and over again to this phrase, VT is not TV. Television is about broadcasting, about taking a signal and getting it out there, right? Videotape can stay in one place. Videotape can just prolong a signal over time. It can let people cogitate on it and experience it repeatedly. And this is a really different thing than the television technologies that it was miniaturizing. So there's this particular language here in this. This is actually Paul Ryan's first publication on this subject, but he went on to write about it a lot. There's this particular phrase, videotape has to do with infolding information, feedback, that bears extremely close reading because every word sort of is doing something interesting. So the word feedback is a word that goes back to the 19th century in control engineering, but that starting in the 40s begins to be used a lot in electronics to talk about systems that put out a signal and then take that signal back in and do something with it repeatedly, right? So this ties the way that people are talking about video to this whole history of cybernetics, and there's a lot to be said there. But there's also this word infolding, which is a much more peculiar word. Feedback shows up when almost anyone talks about video recording in the 60s. Infolding is unusual. Infolding is a word, we'll get to why I'm using a weird philosophy term in a moment. Panpsychism is the theory that we all only have one mind and we share it. So infolding is a word associated with a geologist, a paleontologist, a priest named Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, who had a peculiar theory of the evolution of humanity, and you'll see what this has to do with video in a moment. His peculiar theory was that all of the evolution of life has been divergence until now. And now, because we have more and more ways of communicating with each other, instead of becoming more and more disparate, instead of splitting off into more species, we're actually evolving into a single being, and all of humanity in the future will be one organism. So Teilhard was a Catholic priest, a Jesuit. He was also forbidden from teaching and publishing by the Jesuit order, in part because he believed that this one mind, which we would all share in the future, was the second coming of Jesus. So this is a little bit of a heretical interpretation of the nature of Jesus. He described this moment of unified consciousness as the omega point, and you can see it marked by the letter omega in his diagram here. And in his own writing, And if I catch myself up with my notes, maybe I can tell you when. In his own writing in the 1930s, in a book called The Phenomenon of Man, which I mentioned Teilhard was forbidden from publishing, so it was only published after he died in the 50s, because his heirs were not Jesuits. So when he was writing in the 1930s, he talked about radio as one of the means by which this unified consciousness would come into being. That if we could all hear each other, we could all be one mind. Thanks to the prodigious biological event represented by the discovery of electromagnetic waves, each individual finds himself henceforth simultaneously present in every corner of the earth. So this is the world we live in. And this idea was a big influence on the media theorist Marshall McLuhan, who in Understanding Media in 1964 associated this unification again with electronics and termed it the global village. McLuhan, as an observant Catholic, tried to walk it back a little bit from the theological interpretations, but sort of kept everything else. And Teilhard and McLuhan became intellectual touchstones for the counterculture of the 60s and 70s, in part because they described a world in which hippies' fascination with technologies of consciousness, most often psychedelic drugs, but also videotape, constituted a contribution to this creative evolution, right? So if we have a shared drug experience or a shared videotape experience, we're moving humanity forward towards that point of total shared consciousness. One of the places where you can see this play out is in Gene Youngblood's 1970 book, Expanded Cinema, in which he describes the video sphere based on Teilhard's concept of the noosphere. So Teilhard uses the term noosphere to refer to the shared mind as a geological layer over the earth, that humanity is spread out all over the earth, so mind is spread out all over the earth. Gene Youngblood talks about television being spread out all over the earth and terms that experience, the video sphere. And similarly, in the 1971 book Guerrilla Television by Michael Schamberg, Schamberg writes, videotaping with friends is like having a collective consciousness. So this is about as concrete an expression of this as you can get. Besides videotape, it would take telepathy to internalize that possibility. So this is sort of the significance of this new technology. There's Schamberg. You could also see sort of these collective experiences if you were in that gallery in 1969 at TV as a creative medium. When you stepped off the elevator, you would be part of this group of people facing Wipe Cycle, which was an array of 9 video monitors. And these monitors had a montage that included pre-taped footage of broadcast television, cowls, the Earth from space, a bathtub, the exhibit itself being constructed. But they also had live footage of you right now. And they also had recent footage of you 8 seconds ago. And this was all mixed together in this Wipe Cycle in order to create the impression that you are part of everything, right? You're there with the cows, you're there with the bathtub. One of the creators of this work, Ira Schneider, described it as a somewhat integrating experience in terms of one's place in the universe. And you see some of the same focus on video as a technique for integration in the psychiatric world, seldom on a cosmic scale, but certainly in the context of family therapy and group therapy, the idea that if we watch together and if we watch our group as a group, then we can experience that unified consciousness more fully. And again, these communities of psychotherapy and the behavioral and social sciences come together with artistic communities. In 1969 at a conference on social change, Gillette and Ryan meet the anthropologist Gregory Bateson, who is perhaps best known as the ex-husband of Margaret Mead, but who was also a founder of the field of cybernetics, a founder of the field of family therapy, an early ethnographic filmmaker alongside Mead in the 30s. And he was handing out at this conference an essay that he called The Cybernetics of Self, a Theory of Alcoholism, which was trying to very practically explain how to cure alcoholism, but it had a much more abstract metaphysical dimension about this idea of mind as a unified, shared phenomenon. That critique of the self, that idea that mind isn't really something that you can own, but it's really something that we share, really influenced Gillette and Ryan in their art as well. So Ryan wrote, "The cybernetic extension of ourselves possible with videotape does not mean a reinforcement of the ordinarily understood self, but instead could mean an integration of the self with the environmental and social systems around us. And you see this in the later work of these artists. Frank Gillette does a whole set of work that's essentially surveillance art with animals and plants, and embeds the gallery goer in this sort of community of existence that isn't even just human, but that is of life itself. So video is seen as this tool that can be used to connect everybody up together. The most durable cultural artifact of the age of video therapy, though, demonstrated fixation on the self rather than striving for communal consciousness. After his career in experimental video, Michael Shamberg became a Hollywood producer. Michael Shamberg, collaborator with these guys, but also the author of Guerrilla Television, which I mentioned a moment ago. He became a producer, which he still is, and his first major success was 1983's The Big Chill, in which William Hurt self-administers video therapy. So there's this sort of translation of these experimental practices of the 60s into this nostalgic film, reprocessing those experimental practices to sort of demonstrate where they had gone. There was another route that people were experimenting with to collective consciousness through video that was quite different from watching yourself or your community on tape, and this was video synthesizers. The only single channel video exhibited on an unmodified monitor at TV as a creative medium, so sort of the most straightforward work in a way, was Psychedelivision in Color by Eric Siegel, which was a collection of 3 short works, one of which was this one, Einstein, which featured the face of Einstein. For some reason, his name's misspelled in Siegel's work. I don't know why, but we'll go with it. Featured his face garishly colored and distorted by optical feedback effects, producing sensations of rushing forward into the screen or of loss of control. For some who saw this, this was a new aesthetic. So the artist Woody Vasulka said, "Something extraordinary happened when we saw that flaming face of Einstein at the end of the corridor. Something finally free of film." So this is perhaps a pivotal moment in video as a medium. Siegel's intention was to place us as viewers inside a dream that he had had. He had actually seen this while sleeping, he said, right? He had seen Einstein shifting and brightly colored. But he had grander ambitions than that in terms of using video to create these psychological experiences. He told Gene Youngblood, "I see television as a psychic healing medium creating mass cosmic consciousness." And he spent a few years building increasingly complex tools for electronically manipulating video. Siegel was sort of one of the original seeds of the world of video synthesizers, and several of the later engineers in that area would refer back to him as an influence. But he gave up with it because he was unable to create mandalas to alter states of consciousness. And if you can't do that, what's the point? Among those inspired by Siegel's work was the Korean-American artist Namjoon Paik, who built his own synthesizers with Japanese television engineer Shuya Abe, and thought of this as a console for electronic painting, providing the autonomy that you couldn't get if you were working in a TV studio alongside professional engineers. Boston public television station WGBH broadcast Paik's video commune, subtitled "The Beatles Beginning to End," because that was the audio accompaniment, was the whole catalog of the Beatles, in 1970. And so this involved colorizing, mixing, and cutting between 7 different black and white cameras. It involved a device called a wobulator, which allowed the deformation of the TV raster from a straightforward rectangle into twisted shapes. Again, there was a sort of attempt to build new aesthetics out of this video technology, sometimes with this conversation happening around them of allowing us to see inside each other's minds in ways that we might not with a straightforward, more photographic image. Many of the engineers of these synthesizers conceptualized the machines that they were building as analog computers. So Dan Sandine, for example, built a machine in Chicago called the image processor, which he's demonstrating here, which would take luminance, light from the camera, and allow all sorts of manipulation of it, multiplying it, connecting it to an oscillator, keying, etc. And this was talked about as analog computing because it involved taking some natural phenomenon and by analogy manipulating it as voltage. And the analog in analog computing refers to this analogy as much as it does anything else. This had a lot of advantages over, this is what happens if you colorize it. So these analog techniques had a lot of advantages over the digital computing that was developing alongside them. Real-time processing and control, for example, digital computing was slow in 1973. The disadvantage was that these machines were notoriously unruly. Their behavior depended on complex configurations of knobs and patch cords, so effects were difficult to replicate. Starting in about 1973 then, a number of artists began using digital computers as controllers for analog synthesizers. So this is another of my favorite archives finds, which is, again, in the New York State Council on the Arts records, this phenomenon of state agencies collecting grant applications ends up to be an incredible resource. And this is a plan for hooking up a digital computer called a PDP-8 with a bunch of video equipment. And this plan, I think, was not executed exactly as written, but similar things happened in the 1970s at a number of experimental video locations. The closest thing to this happened at WNET in New York. These attempts drew on an existing fascination with digital technologies in the world of analog video. So the sort of key magazine of this community was called Radical Software, and software was a term that blurred analog and digital. The content of a tape could be called software, but so could the content of a computer. And you can see a sort of at least a geometrically precise aesthetic on the cover here that has some digital resonances. Once they began using digital computers, many of these artists really sort of let them take over their work. Stephen Beck built analog video synthesizers and then built entirely digital machines like the Video Weaver in 1976. So one of the threads of my more recent research is extending this analysis of analog and digital from video art to commercial production by examining the history of the Scanimate, a machine which was technically similar to video synthesizers, but was used to animate text and graphics in film and television production during the 1970s. This particular Scanimate is owned by an operator of it named Dave Seig, who began working with it when these things were still used in the late 1970s and early 1980s, and has kept at it. The Scanimate began with experiments by an illustrator turned engineer named Lee Harrison in electronic animation. The Bone Generator, which made this video, and you can see it's called the Bone Generator because it makes a bunch of lines, and you can call the lines bones if you want to be creepy, which they did, right? So the Bone Generator had both analog and digital components. This is sort of the starting place. And then one of the directions that they go with it is they build what they call an anthropometric harness, which allows a dancer to control the bones in real time. That doesn't really have a market. Lee Harrison even tries to sell it to NASA. He says rather than sending cameras into space, they could send the astronauts up with sensors on the joints of their suits, and they could just have animated astronauts on TV. We don't have to see the moon landing on live video. We can even do the animation so it looks like live video. Nobody will know the difference, right? NASA doesn't go along with this. Although, you know, it would have been cheaper to fake the moon landing that way. So Scanimate becomes a component of these complex systems that involve a lot of analog video, a lot of analog and digital electronics, film cameras, and it gets used particularly across the decade of the 1970s for animating logos and logo types. So this is a demo reel. Most advertisements that you see from the 1970s have some Scanimate work in them. And it really sort of dominates this industry until the early 80s when digital machines became faster and cheaper. It was also used for effects in films, including Logan's Run and Star Wars. And like video synthesizers, it was also connected to digital computers in efforts to achieve greater control. Using the Scanimate involved knobs and switches, but it also involved sculptural and optical manipulation. So to create a flying, rotating gold logo like this, for example, an operator would use luminance oscillators to produce glistening color, but they would also physically carve the logo out of balsa wood, paint the front and sides in contrasting colors, place it on a turntable in front of the camera, and then they would actually spin the logo around, and they would just add the glittery effects and the gold color and so on in the machine. So there was a complicated hybrid set of activities that involved manipulating light by literally manipulating light and manipulating light as an analog that was actually electricity inside the machine and then was displayed on a monitor and turned back into light. So I've been using this kind of practice to historicize the categories of analog and digital, which have become a totalizing dichotomy, right? In the last 50 years, everything that isn't digital has become analog. So we talk about film as analog, we talk about board games as analog, but in this moment, they weren't, because analog was the specific thing about converting signals from one medium to another, keeping that analogy going, right? And so when we go back to that, we can sort of think about the specificity of analog electronic technology that television, videotape, audio tape, vinyl records, right, have in common. Vinyl records do it without the electronics necessarily, but they still have the direct analogy between sound and physical depth, which is something that fits this kind of theme. It's perhaps ironic that in the decades since, digital and analog have become associated respectively with progress and tradition, because one of the main reasons why people adopted digital technology was its capacity for memory, right? These complicated analog machines, you could get them to do exactly what you wanted, and then if you unplugged something, you couldn't figure out how to do it again, whereas computer programs are reasonably consistent. To return to the Haraway quotation with which I started, our best machines are made of sunshine only if we ignore the material resources and labor that go into making them and making them work. Often, the discourse of the digital is about precisely that. Digital technologies are different from analog ones in their capacities for precision, in their literary programmability, in the control and repeatability that these features facilitate. But there is also a historical continuity between digital and analog electronics, both materially, things like magnetic tape show up in the same ways in both contexts, and in the discursive formations through which we comprehend them. We continue to see visions of ethereality and collective consciousness in contemporary discourses about the cloud, transhumanism, and the singularity. The components that make up discourses of digitality, the invisibility of the magnetic recordings on which our computers often still rely, the utopian hope that we're extending mind itself over new communications networks, have long histories deeply embedded in the changing forms of media in the 20th century. Thank you.